The real story. Horror. Only. At Mr. Scare.
I don't usually drink alone, but that night, I needed it. It was one of those unbearable evenings when the weight of the day clung to me like a wet coat. Work had been hell. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with obligations I didn't care for, and the suffocating silence of my apartment was too much to bear. I needed somewhere dim, somewhere quiet, somewhere that wouldn't ask questions. That's how I ended up at the Velvet Nightcap. It wasn't your typical bar. Hidden in an alley off a forgotten street, it was the kind of place you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. The glowing red sign above the door flickered weakly, and the faint sound of piano jazz spilled into the night. The name felt like a whisper, an invitation only the desperate or curious could hear. The moment I stepped inside, the world outside seemed to dissolve. The room was bathed in crimson light, the kind that softened edges and distorted reality. Velvet curtains draped the walls, and the bar itself was a polished black wood slab gleaming under the dim glow of hanging chandeliers. There were patrons, but they were scattered, silent, nursing drinks with a haunted intensity. I took a seat at the bar. The bartender, a tall man in a crisp suit with eyes so pale they seemed to glow, approached without a word and set a glass of amber liquid in front of me. "I didn't order," I said, startled.
"It's on the house,"
he replied, his voice smooth and deep, like a late-night radio host.
"First drink's always free."
I hesitated, but the warmth of the glass in my hand was strangely comforting. I took a sip. The drink was unlike anything I'd ever tasted, sweet, smoky, with a depth that felt almost alive. It coursed through me like a second heartbeat, and for a moment, the weight of the world lifted. The first hint that something was wrong came with the man sitting 2 seats down from me. I hadn't noticed him when I walked in, but now his presence was impossible to ignore. He was hunched over, muttering to himself, his fingers tapping a frantic rhythm against his glass.
"Didn't ask for it,"
he mumbled.
"Didn't want it."
I leaned closer. "You okay?" His head snapped toward me, and I recoiled at the sight of his face. His eyes were sunken, his skin ashen, and his lips trembled as he whispered,
"Don't stay too long. They always make you stay too long."
Before I could respond, the bartender appeared between us.
"Everything all right here?"
he asked, his tone polite but sharp. The man flinched, shaking his head.
No, it's fine, just leaving."
He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair, and stumbled toward the door. Except he didn't make it. The second he reached the exit, a shadow moved. It was subtle at first, a ripple along the velvet curtains. But then it grew, stretching and darkening, wrapping itself around the man like living smoke. He froze, his body rigid, his eyes wide with terror. And then, just like that, he was gone. No one else reacted. The other patrons continued sipping their drinks, lost in their own thoughts. The bartender smiled at me, as if nothing had happened.
"Another round?"
he asked. I should have left. I should have bolted out of there and never looked back. But something kept me in my seat. Maybe it was the drink, warm and comforting, or the way the crimson light made everything feel dreamlike. Or maybe it was the shadow in the corner, watching me. I ordered another drink. As the bartender poured, I noticed a mirror behind the bar, its surface clouded and warped. It didn't reflect the room correctly. The patrons looked wrong. Their faces were blurred, their movements sluggish, like they were underwater. But what chilled me most was my own reflection. I wasn't there. I downed the second drink in one gulp, trying to shake the growing unease. "What is this place for the soul?" I asked the bartender. He smiled, his 2 pale eyes locking onto mine.
"It's exactly where you need to be."
The next twist came when I decided to leave. I'd had enough. The strange atmosphere, the disappearing man, the warped reflections. I stood, unsteady on my feet, and made my way to the door. But the door wasn't there. In its place was a wall of velvet curtains. I turned, panic rising, and found that the entire bar had shifted. The patrons were gone, their chairs empty. The bartender was nowhere to be seen. Even the music had stopped, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I pulled back the curtains, desperate to find an exit. Behind them was another room, identical to the one I'd just left. The same bar, the same chairs, the same mirror. Except this time, I wasn't alone. The man who had disappeared was sitting at the bar, his back to me. Slowly, he turned, and I saw his face, twisted and inhuman. His eyes, black voids, his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile.
Your turn.
He rasped. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran, tearing through curtain after curtain, each one leading to another identical room. The shadows followed me, growing larger, darker, closing in. Finally, I stumbled into a room that was different. In the center stood the bartender, his pale eyes glowing in the dim light. Behind him was a door, solid, real, and slightly ajar.
Leaving so soon?
He asked, his voice calm, almost amused. What is this place? I demanded, my voice trembling. What do you want from me? He tilted his head, considering me.
This place gives you what you need. A drink, an escape. A reminder.
A reminder of what?
That some doors should never be opened.
The shadow surged forward, and I bolted for the door. I didn't look back. When I woke up, I was lying in the alley outside the Velvet Nightcap, my head pounding. The bar was gone, just an empty lot with no sign it had ever existed. I staggered home, trying to convince myself it had been a bad dream, some hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when I emptied my pockets, I found it. A receipt. The words on it were simple. 1 drink, paid in full. And at the bottom, scrawled in red ink, was a single word. See you. I wasn't supposed to be at the bar that night. It had been one of those long, soul-sucking work days that leave you questioning your life choices. My plan was to go straight home, microwave some leftovers, and pass out. But as I walked past the hollow oak, the flickering neon sign, and the faint sound of blues drifting from inside stopped me in my tracks. I'd passed the place 100 times, but had never gone in. Something about it always seemed off. That night, though, I pushed open the door. Just 1 drink, I told myself. The air inside was thick with smoke and the smell of aged whiskey. Dim, amber lights hung low, casting long shadows across the polished wood bar. A jukebox in the corner played a haunting tune I didn't recognize. The place wasn't crowded, just a few patrons scattered across the room, each lost in their own world. I took a seat at the bar, where a bartender with slicked back hair and a crisp white shirt greeted me with a polite but practiced smile. "What's your poison?" he asked. "Whiskey. Neat," I said. He nodded and poured the drink, his movements unnaturally smooth, almost mechanical. As I raised the glass to my lips, I noticed a small, ornate carving etched into the bar's surface, a swirling pattern that seemed to shift when I tilted my head. I brushed my fingers over it, absent-mindedly. It felt warm, almost alive. "That's an old charm," the bartender said, his voice low. "For protection." "Protection from what?" I asked, half joking. He didn't answer, just gave me a knowing smile and moved to serve someone else. The first drink went down too easily, so I ordered another. By the time I was on my third, I noticed something strange. The patrons. They weren't talking. Not to each other. Not to the bartender. Not even on their phones. They just sat there, staring at their drinks or into the shadows of the room. One man, seated a few stools away, caught my eye. His face was pale and gaunt, his sunken eyes fixed on the glass in front of him. It was full, untouched. Every so often, he'd glance toward the far corner of the bar, where the shadows seemed darker, deeper than they should have been. "New here?" a voice asked, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see a woman sitting beside me, her red lipstick a sharp contrast to her pale skin. She had an aura about her, like she didn't quite belong, like she was from another time. "Yeah," I said. "First time. You?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've been coming here a long time. Too long, maybe." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, laughing nervously. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the bar, the same one the pale man had been staring at. "This place, it's not like other bars. People don't come here just to drink." "Then why do they come?" Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt like she was looking through me. "You'll see." As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The shadows in the corner seemed to pulse, creeping closer every time I glanced away. The pale man was still there, but now his hands were trembling, his lips moving as if he were praying. The jukebox suddenly stopped, the abrupt silence sending a chill through the room. The bartender turned, wiping his hands on a towel, and looked directly at me. "Another drink?" he asked. I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my body refused to move. "Sure," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As he poured, I noticed something reflected in the mirror behind the bar. Something that wasn't in the room. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its head tilted slowly, as if it were watching me. I whipped around, but the bar was empty. Nothing but the same patrons, the same oppressive darkness. "Am I seeing things?" I muttered to myself. The woman beside me leaned in close. "No," she whispered. "It's seeing you." I decided I'd had enough. Tossing a few bills onto the bar, I stood to leave. But as I turned toward the door, I froze. The exit was gone. In its place was a wall of mirrors, each one reflecting the room back at me from impossible angles. The patrons were there, but their reflections were wrong, twisted, distorted, their faces stretched into grotesque shapes, their eyes hollow and black. "Sit down," the bartender said, his voice sharp. "You can't leave yet." "Like hell I can't," I snapped, backing toward the mirrors. The pale man suddenly stood, his glass shattering as it hit the floor. "Don't touch the mirrors!" he screamed. Too late. My hand grazed the surface of the nearest one, and the world tilted. I was no longer in the bar. The room around me was vast and empty, filled with a suffocating darkness that seemed to move like a living thing. The mirrors were still there, suspended in the void, but now they showed scenes. People sitting at the bar, staring into their drinks, their faces frozen in despair. And then I saw myself, sitting on the same stool, my eyes glazed over, a drink clutched in my hand. I was mouthing words over and over, but I couldn't hear them. The figure from the mirror appeared beside me, its elongated limbs reaching out. Its face was featureless, but I could feel its gaze. "Drink," it said, its voice like nails on glass. "Stay." "No!" I screamed, stumbling back. The figure moved closer, its hands outstretched, its fingers wrapping around my throat. I woke up on the sidewalk outside the hollow oak, gasping for air. The neon sign flickered above me, casting erratic shadows. My watch read 3 a.m., but it felt like days had passed. The bar was gone, just an empty lot where it had stood. But in my hand I was still holding the glass, and when I looked into its surface I saw them. The bartender, the woman, the pale man. trapped in the reflection, their eyes pleading, waiting. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. I'd sworn off bars, too many nights wasted, too much money burned. But life had a way of wearing you down. After a crushing day at work and a fight with my roommate over rent, I found myself wandering the city streets, my hands buried in my pockets as the cold wind bit through my jacket. That's when I saw it. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the distance, glowing crimson against the misty night. The Black Rose Bar. The name was subtle, almost poetic, but the building looked ancient, with cracked brick walls and ivy creeping up its sides. It felt out of place among the modern high-rises. I'd never noticed it before, even though I'd walked this route countless times. The pull was inexplicable. My feet moved before my mind could catch up, and within minutes, I was pushing the heavy oak door open. A bell above it chimed, and I stepped into a world that felt like stepping back in time. The interior was unlike any bar I'd ever been to. The air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and something faintly sweet, like roses left to rot. Dim, flickering candles illuminated the room, casting dancing shadows on the dark red walls. The patrons were an eclectic mix, men and women of all ages, dressed in styles that seemed plucked from different eras. Some wore modern suits, others looked like they'd walked straight out of the 1920s. At the far end of the bar stood a man who seemed to command the entire room without saying a word. He was tall, with slicked back hair, and a suit that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. His eyes were sharp, almost predatory, and yet his smile was warm, inviting. "First time here?" he asked, as I approached the bar. I nodded, feeling out of place. "Yeah, I didn't even know this place existed." He chuckled, a low, melodic sound. "Not many do. We don't advertise. People find us when they need us." I frowned, confused. "Need me for what?" "To leave this place," he said cryptically, sliding a glass of amber liquid my way. The color seemed to shimmer unnaturally under the dim bar lights. "On the house. Trust me, you'll need it." I hesitated, my eyes flicking between the drink and his unreadable expression. It smelled faintly of whiskey, but there was something else, a strange, sharp aroma that pricked at my senses. Against my better judgment, I took a sip. Warmth spread through me instantly, but it wasn't comforting. It was electric, like a current sparking under my skin. The taste lingered, almost too sweet, with an unsettling aftertaste I couldn't place. The night grew stranger as it went on. The patrons barely spoke, but their eyes lingered on me, unblinking and curious. The music playing from the old jukebox in the corner seemed to shift with my emotions. Melancholic when I thought of my fight earlier, upbeat when I tried to shake it off. It was unsettling but oddly comforting. After my second drink, the bartender leaned closer. "How about a game, D?" he asked, his voice almost too smooth. "What kind of game?" I asked warily. "A chance to change your fortune. One task, one reward. You'd be surprised what people leave here with." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like a scam." He smirked. "No money involved, just choices." Before I could respond, he slid a small black box onto the counter. It was unmarked, with no hinges or seams. "Open it," he said. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped the lid open, and inside was a single red rose, perfectly preserved. Its petals seemed to shimmer unnaturally, as if they were made of glass. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "A gift. Or a curse. It depends on what you do next." The room seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier. The other patrons were no longer looking at me. They were staring at the rose, their expressions unreadable. "I don't understand," I said. "You will," the bartender replied, his eyes darkening. "Take it to the woman in the corner booth. She's been waiting for you." I turned to look and saw her for the first time. She was sitting alone in the shadows, her face obscured by the dim light. Something about her posture, the way she sat, perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on the table, sent a chill down my spine. Reluctantly, I picked up the box and walked over. As I approached, she looked up, and I froze. Her eyes weren't human. They were entirely black, with no whites, no pupils, just endless, inky voids. She smiled, and her teeth were too sharp, too perfect. "You're late," she said, her voice like silk. I placed the box on the table, my hands trembling. I don't know what this is about," I stammered. "You will," she replied, echoing the bartender's words. "Sit." The conversation that followed was fragmented, surreal. She spoke in riddles, her voice weaving in and out of my thoughts like a melody I couldn't quite grasp. She asked me strange questions about my fears, my regrets, my darkest secrets. And all the while, the rose in the box seemed to glow brighter, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. At some point, the bartender joined us, his presence grounding the room but adding to the tension. "Have you made your decision?" he asked her. She nodded, then turned to me. "It's your turn now. Choose." "Choose what?" I asked, my voice cracking. "To stay," she said simply, "or to leave." I stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the floor. "I don't want any part of this," I said, backing away. "I just wanted a drink." The bartender sighed, almost pityingly. They always say that. Before I could respond, the room shifted. The walls seemed to bend and twist, the shadows stretching unnaturally. The other patrons turned to look at me, their faces blank, their eyes black like hers. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding. The bartender didn't stop me, but as I reached the exit, his voice echoed behind me. "Remember, you chose to leave." When I burst onto the street, the city was unrecognizable. The buildings were warped, their windows glowing faintly with an eerie red light. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the once busy streets were empty. I looked back at the bar, but it was gone. In its place stood a crumbling ruin, overgrown with vines and lit by a pale, flickering light. And then I saw it, a single red rose lying on the ground in front of me. Its petals shimmered faintly, almost mocking. I picked it up, and as I did, a voice whispered in my ear, "You'll be back." I never went near that part of the city again, but every so often, when I close my eyes, I see the rose, glowing faintly in the darkness, and I hear the bartender's voice, smooth and unrelenting. "You chose to leave, but the game isn't over." I've always been reckless, chasing risks like they were challenges to prove my invincibility. So when I found myself on the Strip in Vegas, broke, humiliated, and completely drained, it felt like I'd finally hit the wall I'd been running toward my entire life. The casino hadn't just taken my money, it had ripped away every shred of confidence I had left. Bright neon lights flashed mockingly overhead, advertising the dreams I could no longer afford to chase. I wandered aimlessly through the crowds of tourists and high rollers, my mind racing with desperate thoughts. Rent was due in 2 weeks, my savings were gone, and the job I hated back home would barely cover the damage I'd done tonight. Somewhere between the despair and the drunken haze, I found myself standing outside a bar. It wasn't flashy like the rest of the Strip. No bright signs, no music spilling out onto the sidewalk. It looked like a place that belonged to the shadows, tucked away for people who wanted to disappear. Perfect. Inside, the lighting was dim, red-tinted and oppressive, like being submerged underwater. The place was nearly empty. A lone bartender polished glasses at the counter, and a couple of tired-looking patrons nursed their drinks in silence. It smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke, but I didn't care. I slid onto a bar stool and ordered whiskey, then another, and another. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting at the far end of the bar, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. His suit was immaculate, blacker than midnight, with a blood-red tie that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. His features were sharp, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were like twin voids, absorbing everything and giving nothing back. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice smooth and disarming, like velvet over a blade. I glared at him, too drained to care about politeness. "What do you think?" He chuckled softly, leaning forward so the light caught his face. "Vegas has a way of chewing people up and spitting them out, doesn't it? One minute you're on top of the world. The next, well, here you are." "Here I am," I muttered, taking another sip of whiskey. "What do you want? To gloat?" "Not at all," he said, his smile widening just enough to be unsettling. "I'm here to offer you something. A way out." I barked a laugh, though it came out bitter and hollow. "Yeah? What's the catch? My soul?" He tilted his head, amused. "People always jump to that conclusion. No soul required, just your time, and your willingness to take a little risk." The word risk hit me like a jolt. My guard should have gone up, but instead, curiosity began to creep in. "What kind of risk?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card, sliding it across the bar toward me. The surface was glossy, reflecting the red light above us, but the only detail on it was an address printed in small silver lettering. "Show up here at midnight," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We'll talk more then." I stared at the card, my mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. "Why me?" I asked, finally meeting his gaze. He smirked, his dark eyes gleaming. "You got the look, and the guts. It's just for 3 nights. After that, you'll have everything you lost, and then some." The first night felt straightforward, almost too easy. I took to the role like any bartender would, pouring drinks, wiping down counters, and occasionally nodding along to a slurred story about a lost love or a bad hand at the poker table. The patrons, though, were off, too quiet, too polite. Their eyes lingered too long, their smiles a fraction too wide. A man in a dusty trench coat ordered a whiskey neat, but when I poured, he muttered under his breath, "It won't be strong enough," before downing it in one gulp and walking out without paying. Red Tie stayed in the corner, always watching, his cold gaze like a weight pressing against my back. Occasionally, he'd nod, as if approving of my technique. When the clock struck 3 a.m., the patrons left in a silent, orderly fashion. Red Tie approached the counter and slid a stack of crisp $100 bills across it. "Good work," he said, his tone unsettlingly neutral. "Same time tomorrow." The cash felt wrong in my hand, heavier than it should have been, but I shoved the unease aside. It was just bartending, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. When I returned the second night, the bar had changed. It wasn't the layout or the lighting. Those were the same. But the air felt heavier, colder, like the building itself had shifted overnight. The patrons were stranger this time. Their voices were low, speaking in hushed tones, and the language was unfamiliar. It wasn't Spanish or French or anything I could place. It sounded guttural, ancient, and every time I tried to listen closer, a sharp headache bloomed behind my eyes. A man in a suit approached the counter, his face unnervingly symmetrical. He handed me a slip of paper with his drink order. The ingredients made no sense: black salt, absinthe, and something called nightshade extract. I hesitated, reading the list over and over, my pulse quickening. But before I could ask questions, Red Tie appeared beside me. His presence was so sudden and silent that I nearly dropped the paper. "Just make the drink," he said, his voice a command. I mixed the concoction with trembling hands, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. When I handed it to the man, he smiled, revealing unnaturally sharp teeth that gleamed in the dim light. "Cheers," he said, raising the glass in a mock toast before draining it in one gulp. As he set the glass down, The liquid inside seemed to ripple unnaturally, defying gravity for a brief second. He licked his lips and walked away without another word. When the night ended, Red Tie handed me another stack of cash. This time, his smile seemed wider, more satisfied. "You're doing well," he said. "One more night." Every instinct screamed at me not to go back, but the allure of the money and the burning curiosity drew me in. The bar was emptier than before. Only one patron sat at the counter, a woman with pale skin that seemed to glow under the dim lights. Her eyes were too bright, her movements unnervingly fluid. She didn't order anything. She just stared, her lips curling into a faint smile whenever I glanced her way. At midnight, Red Tie appeared, sliding a small black key across the counter. "What's this for?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's a room in the back," he said. "You'll know it when you see it. All you have to do is open the door." The key felt icy in my palm. I wanted to refuse, to walk out and never look back. But the weight of his gaze pinned me in place. Reluctantly, I nodded and made my way down the narrow hallway at the back of the bar. The door was plain, unmarked, and unremarkable. But the closer I got, the more the air around it seemed to hum, like static electricity. My hand shook as I inserted the key and turned it. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach churn. The room was dark, save for a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Chains dangled from the walls, their metal rusted and stained. In the center of the room was a table. Dark stains covered its surface, and sitting in the corner, barely illuminated by the flickering light, was a figure. "Help me," they whispered, their voice trembling. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "What is this?" I shouted, spinning around to see Red Tie standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "This," he said, stepping inside, "is your final task." He handed me a knife, its blade gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. "Do it, and your debts are cleared. Walk away, and, well, you won't like the alternative." I looked back at the figure, now fully illuminated. It was a young man, his face pale and gaunt, his wrists bound by thick chains. His eyes pleaded with me, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I can't," I stammered, dropping the knife. Red Tie's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. "Then you've wasted my time." The room seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in. The chains rattled, the bulb flickered faster, and the young man's cries grew louder. Red Tie stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "You don't get to walk away," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Not from this." I woke up in my hotel room, drenched in sweat. The cash was gone, the key was gone, but on the nightstand was a single black card with silver letters. "You still owe us." I packed my things and left Vegas that morning, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Every night, I hear the chains rattling, the young man's cries, and Red Tie's voice, cold and unrelenting. And sometimes when I'm alone, I feel a presence, watching, waiting. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Please hit follow to support the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. See you soon, and goodbye.